afternoon. I am Metropolitan Council Vice Chair Reva Chambliss, and it's time to begin this meeting of the Metropolitan Council. It's Wednesday, January 10th, 2024, and I call this meeting to order. Are there any changes to the agenda? If not, we will move on. And the first order of business is approval of the minutes from the December 13th, 2023 council meeting. Can I have a motion and a second to approve the minutes?
So moved.
So moved by Johnson, second.
Second.
Second by Carter. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? This motion is adopted. At this point in the meeting, we can ask the members of the public who wish to address the council on matters not on the agenda that they may do so. You may limit your comments to 3 minutes. We don't have anyone signed up, so we will move on. Our next order of business is approval of the consent agenda. Can we have a motion and a second for the consent agenda?
So moved. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? That motion carries. Next, we have non-consent business items and reports from our standing committees. And we'll first hear from the Community Development Committee, Councilmember Lilligren.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to my colleagues, and welcome back. And I really want to thank Councilmember Bento, who stepped up as the Vice Chair of the Community Development Committee and chaired in my absence. So thanks, you got a lot of good work done. So the Community Development Committee brings 3 items for consideration tonight. We're giving out money. So that's always kind of a good feeling as well. So this, the first is not to you, Councilmember Pacheco. The first is funding recommendations for our 2023 home ownership program. It's business item 2023-269. We're going to award $2.8 million in livable communities, local housing incentive account grants to support 5 home ownership development projects. This funding cycle, the council received 8 applications for home ownership projects in 5 cities. The total amount of funding requested exceeded the funding available in the cycle. In review of these items, the committee is forwarding award recommendations for projects in Edina, Minnetonka, Golden Valley, Minneapolis, and St. Paul. Upon completion, these projects are expected to result in 22 new affordable ownership homes. And I'll just remind council members that this is only our 2nd year of this home ownership award program within the livable communities local housing incentive account. So, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council award 5 home ownership local housing incentive account grants as shown in the table 1 of the business item, totaling $2,825,034, and to authorize the Executive Director of Community Development to execute these grant agreements on behalf of the council.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by Tony Carter. Any discussion?
Yeah. You know, I was just trying to get some insight into this. Especially I was looking at one for Edina. So that's $750,000. And that's 5 houses. 5 homes, right? So that's $150,000. Is this supposed to be low-income housing or?
Thank you for that question. Do we have someone that?
Director Barajas is here, or possibly other staff, Madam Chair. Ms. Berkey.
Hi. Sarah Berkey, the Senior Manager for Livable Communities.
So my question is, because I know you guys use AIM, right? To try to determine what's affordable. And I was just trying to look at what, typically, what's the profile of the family that would be living in this house? And what would their income be and able to afford this $150,000 house? And would that be a low-income person? Is that middle income? Is that upper? Who are we funding?
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Carter for the question. It's a great question. And the funding recommendations report has a lot more detail on this, and would be happy to walk through it with anybody. Attachment D, I think it is, on the report, I'm just pulling it up now, has kind of some of the way the numbers work for each of the proposals. So I direct your attention to that. With the Edina projects, this is a program the city has to purchase homes that are relatively affordable within the city of Edina, and then make them available directly to families with an income restriction on them, to preserve the more affordable parts of housing in the city. And so it's a really cool program, that one specifically. Each of the homes is anticipated to cost about $500,000 in total and be worth $475,000 or so on the market, but with subsidy to the homeowner and subsidy in the project, including this funding among other sources of funding, the cost to the buyer would be either $192,000 at the lowest or $304,000 at the highest, and that would represent a range of, I think it's 60 to 80% of the area median income. So there's a bunch of different layers of subsidy that go into these projects.
So were these individuals that applied, these were individuals that applied for this grant?
Cities.
The city applies for the grant,
Right.
and then a person has to apply to receive the grant.
Right, so Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Carter, the grant goes to the city of Edina. The city works typically with a developer to actually do the real estate part of the transaction, any development or rehab that needs to happen, and then in partnership with a marketing partner or sales partner, we call it in this chart, they would identify a homeowner who qualifies for the program based on their income level, and would also provide them with, home buyer education or other kinds of supports to get into the home. And so for the city of Edina, for example, that's Homes Within Reach, which is a community land trust.
Yeah, so I was just trying to get a picture of a family, what would be the typical annual salary that a family would have to have in order to afford that home?
Yeah.
It's 50 to 80% of the AMI.
Based on the area
Or you
median
want attachment D,
income.
is that?
And we do have I'm just checking our own website, we have the kind of the income levels and, maximum price of the home for each of these different levels of affordability all on our website in the housing planning section. And so, looks like for a family at 80% of your area median income this year, that's $94,650 in annual income. And then the affordable home price for that family is $304,700. So that's the maximum cost to the buyer of that home in that example.
And so typically, how much would a person have to earn in order to afford a house of that?
$95,000 would be the maximum income for the household.
94, that's in,
Family of four.
okay, family of four. So typically, if we were looking at the AMI for a low-income family, how would that come in?
It can be defined, and we define it anywhere from 30 to 80% AMI on our website for homeownership. So a 30% AMI homeownership project would be targeted at a family earning no more than $37,250 a year. And then each project kind of has a target income level that's defined in the application that we then fund in our recommendations.
Yeah, because
Councilmember Johnson, did you have a question? Or did
No,
that?
just
your
making sure that you kind of understand, if I may, Madam Chair, that this has multiple layers of partners, and you'll see in this one too, the affordability mechanism is that the community land trust will be underpinning this purchase and making sure that the affordability stays with that home. So there's some in perpetuity with the affordability, and what it does do is it gives a family of four the ability to live in this community where they never could if it hadn't been underwritten in this sort of an arrangement with these partnerships and funding agreements in place.
okay, the reason I brought this up is I got quite a few calls about this. People were upset. So I wanted to try to gain an understanding as to specifically If I look at the history, is this, because this has happened before, right? So if I look at the history of this program, I would like to understand that this is a program that definitely benefited low-income people, and that we weren't putting together programs to benefit middle or upper-middle-class people that happened to apply for the program and receive it. Whereas, because one of the big problem is you have a lot of people living in this area. Even the children will grow up and they can't afford to live near their parents. And you also have people that live, that work in this area, that can't afford to buy homes in these areas. So that's why I have concern when I see a program like this. I want to make sure it's targeted for somebody that's authentically going to benefit from it, and not someone that could otherwise afford to live there, that just took advantage of the program.
Points, very good points. Councilmember Carter and then Councilmember Cedarburg.
I appreciate the questioning and the concern for ensuring that we are able to target at lower levels of affordability through the programs and the resources that we have. I know that we had a conversation or a discussion about just that point as we were looking at this coming through committee. And it is very, very difficult, for us to want to prioritize our funding for higher levels. We need housing at all points, at all ranges. And so this helps us to target in the ranges that we're seeing here, but the discussion is still very, very important. And we have asked for information to help us figure out how, with the partnerships that we have or new partnerships, we may be able to target for those lower income families as well. I appreciate your questioning. I think it's very important that we continue to ask those questions and that we discuss that on an ongoing basis toward some solutions. There are a number of partners that we talked about who really are focusing in on these lower levels and housing affordability, not just housing, but home ownership affordability at those lower levels. So I, together with you, and I know the rest of the council, look forward to that ongoing conversation and to solutions in that regard.
Thank you. And the reason, and otherwise, even if I hadn't received any calls, if you look nationally, African Americans, people of color, typically, if you look at the amount of housing that they have, and this is compared to counterparts, it's really, really disproportionate. So whenever I see something like this, of course, a red flag goes up. And I just want to make sure it's not business as usual in a negative sense. So that's all.
Councilmember Cedarburg and then Vento.
I just have a question on the taxes that the homeowners pay taxes on and the basis for that. So you're subsidizing the cost and it could be $300,000 for them, but the taxes and the real value of the house could be much more. And so are they taxed on the higher level, the city tax, or the lower level? And that, I don't know, I don't know about it, but if that's the case, then that is also a burden on the home ownership as well, to pay the higher taxes on a higher valued property.
Vento?
Madam Chair, I think there was a question there, right?
There was a
Councilmember
question
Cedarburg?
on what is,
I don't know
what
if you
taxes,
want,
what
you can
value
answer it, or
do they pay
probably Ms.
taxes on?
Berkey.
Yes.
Sure. Councilmember Cedarburg, I think I'd have to do some research to answer exactly in every circumstance. My understanding is, depending on how the affordability is structured with a community land trust, I think that there's probably a shared tax burden. The land trust retains ownership of the land essentially and the homeowner of the house. And so I think that tax burden is split, but I would need to research to be exactly sure.
And that would make it more affordable.
Certainly taken into account in the underwriting though, either way.
Just I could see them being hit with these taxes.
Vento?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Although I don't represent Edina, I'm on the other side of the river, I do want to note that Edina has been very, very innovative as a city in addressing affordable housing. They have gone above and beyond, and I think are a role model for a whole lot of other communities in our region, in our state, and the nation. So I want to commend Edina for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Good questions, Councilmember Littlegram.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to my colleagues for this conversation. It reflects very closely the conversations we had in Community Development Committee, and Councilmember Carter, a lot of the same issues that you raised were raised in committee. And for folks listening in or for folks that have concerns, I really want to direct people to the business item, and it's actually the very last page of the business item, that attachment D that you're looking at. And thank Ms. Berkey and her staff for presenting this in such a clear and concise grid. But you can see the different levels of affordability, the different levels of subsidy, the different levels of the prices that will be asked. And really, to your last point, the sort of business as usual comment, really direct people's attention to the very bottom of the page where some of the partners who will be helping to do the outreach into communities are listed there. And you can see that it's really focusing on African American, Native, Latinx, Latino, Hmong focus within the buying community. And so these are difficult issues, as we all know, but we're trying to get as sort of granular and surgical as we can at this level.
Thank you.
Very good questions and comments. Councilmember Johnson?
Madam Chair, I was not able to make the last CDC meeting. I think we kind of held over some items on this, if I recall, and City of Minnetonka was one of those holdovers. So I'm very happy to see the change that was made there based on the discussion we had at CDC. And I think that will be a very good project as well, but also some really thorough discussion and research, and then I think a better result back. So, and I think maybe there was just some communication too with the applicant there. So well done on that.
Okay, I think that's all the questions and discussion, so we'll take a vote. All in favor of that business item?
Aye.
Opposed, nay. That motion carries. Next business item.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The next Community Development Committee item coming forward is another funding recommendation action for the 2023 Round 2 Tax-Based Revitalization Account Grants. And it's business item 2023-308. The council received 15 applications totaling $5.6 million in requests for Round 2 of the 2023 funding cycle for the tax-based revitalization account. The committee is recommending awarding 12 applications for projects in Bloomington, Maplewood, Minneapolis, Newport, North St. Paul, South St. Paul, and Shoreview. Upon completion, the projects are expected to result in 43 acres of contamination cleanup, an annual tax base increase of $2.6 million, 192 full-time equivalent jobs added and retained, 427 new affordable housing units, including 81 units affordable to households earning below 30% of the area median income, 140 units at 50% of the area median income, and 206 units at 60% of the area median income, and also over $380 million of leveraged private investment. So, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council award these 12 tax-based revitalization account grants totaling $2,818,800 as shown in Table 1 of the business item, and authorize the Executive Director of Community Development to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the council.
Is there a second? Second by Vento. Any discussion? Vento.
Thank you, Madam Chair. For my colleagues who haven't heard me rant about these cleanups, one of the concerns that I have is that many of the companies businesses, whatever, that leave these properties, these lands in such dire straits, receive tax increment financing. And I consider it unethical for them to have, first off, gotten the tax increment financing and that resulted in them leaving toxic sites. And as many of you know, I get particularly concerned around issues that affect people's health. lead paint, lead pipes, asbestos, PFAS, any of that stuff. And I would hope that we as a council can talk about this more and more, both in terms of these grants. Marcus Martin does a great job working on these, but also in terms of our region being more responsive and responsible as it relates to being good practitioners and cleaning up after ourselves. And it's not just cleaning up after yourself at a picnic in the park. It's cleaning up after yourself as a business when you decide to move elsewhere or just shut down. All too often, some of these sites end up being places where people hang out. And they have no idea the risk that they face as a result of it. So I just needed to say that, and I wanted to make a point that Marcus does a great job on this, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're welcome. I think you made really good points, and responsibility through time is so important, and keeping track of that. Any further discussion?
Asbestos.
So we have had a second and discussion, so I think we're ready to take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. That motion carries. Next item.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And this is the final item Community Development Committee brings forward today. It's another funding recommendation for the 2023 Local Housing Incentives Account multifamily grants. Madam Chair and members, this is business item 2023-310. It's to award $2.5 million in Livable Communities Local Housing Incentive Account grants to funds grant funds to support 5 multifamily development projects. For the Local Housing Incentives Account, the council partners with Minnesota Housing in their consolidated request for proposals process, as well as we consult with cities and counties designated as tax credit sub-allocators that may have additional recommendations for affordable housing projects eligible for the Local Housing Incentives Account. Like in past years, the number of applications and funding requests received far exceeds funding availability across all partners. The committee is forwarding recommendations for awards in Brooklyn Center, Carver, Edina, Maplewood, and Minneapolis. Upon completion, these projects are expected to result in 298 new affordable rental homes, and these local housing incentive account awards will help leverage over $68 million in other public investment and over $61 million in private investment. So, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council award 5 multifamily rental local housing incentive account grants as shown in Table 1 in the business item, totaling $2.5 million for affordable rental projects, and that we authorize the Executive Director of Community Development to execute the grant agreements on behalf of the council.
Thank you for that motion for 2023-310. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by Barber. Any discussion? With no discussion, let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. That motion carries. Next item of business is the Environment Committee, and we'll have Councilmember Lindstrom reporting.
Thank you. 2 items for the council this evening. First one is 2023-299, and this authorizes an increase in the contract value for contract 19P187A. And this is a wastewater treatment plant solids renewal and improvement project. It's project number 805947 and 808920. And it authorizes an increase from 19 million to 21 million. The project, this provides construction, renewal, improvements to the Metro plant. The change orders and the mediated claims resolution exceed the original contract value by a little over $2 million, or approximately 10.7% of the contract. And Council Policy 14-2 requires council authorization before increasing the price of a construction contract more than 10%. Therefore, Madam Chair, members of the council, I move that the council authorizes an increase in the contract value for contract 19P187A. This is the Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant, Solids Renewal and Improvements. Project numbers 805947 and 808920 from $19,303,100 to $21,363,047.
Thank you. Is
There
there,
will be a test on all of these numbers.
very good. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by Cedarburg. Any discussion? With no discussion, let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, nay. That motion carries. One more.
One more, and this is item 2023-301, and this authorizes the administrator to award and execute contract 23P089 with Demcon Trucking to provide waste incinerator ash disposal services at both the Metro plant and Seneca plant in an amount not to exceed $2,745,000. This contract will provide transportation and disposal of waste incinerator ash from both Metro and Seneca. Procurement facilitated a public bid opening on August 16th and received 3 bids for an initial 2-year contract period. The contract will provide service for a period of 2 years with an option to extend for 3 additional 1-year periods. Demcon Trucking was determined to be the low responsible bidder and is being recommended for this award. Therefore, Madam Chair, members, I move that the council authorize its regional administrator to award and execute contract 23P089 with Demcon Trucking to provide waste incinerator ash disposal services at the Metro plant and Seneca plant in an amount not to exceed $2,745,000.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Cedarburg. Any discussion? No discussion. Let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. That motion carries. Next on the agenda, we have the report of Management Committee, which was on the consent agenda already, and Deb Barber for Transportation.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm happy to report I have one business item for you all this evening. So, Madam Chair, council members, business item number 2023-287 is regarding an amendment to a joint powers agreement to support the redevelopment of Central Block Station. The joint powers agreement allows the council and the city of St. Paul to collaboratively support the redevelopment of Central Station Block. This amendment omits references to a statutory right of first refusal, which is not applicable to the council's property. The proposed action further authorizes the regional administrator to make any subsequent non-material amendments to the joint powers agreement. Therefore, Madam Chair, I move that the Metropolitan Council authorize the regional administrator to, 1, execute a first amendment to the joint powers agreement with the City of St. Paul Housing and Redevelopment Authority and the City of St. Paul, and 2, execute any subsequent non-material amendments to support the redevelopment of the Central Station Block.
Very good. Is there a second? Second by Chai Lee. Any discussion? No discussion, so let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Nay. That motion carries. Thank you so much for that report. Now we have other business. We have 3 items of other business tonight, and the first is business item 2024-4. Council members, business item number 2024-4 is regarding appointments to the Transportation Advisory Board, TAB. The TAB was established pursuant to Minnesota state statute, and its purpose is to advise and assist the council with regard to transportation planning and programming for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. The TAB is a 34-member body composed of elected officials, representatives of government agencies involved in transportation issues, citizen members, and members who represent modes of transportation. The Metropolitan Council appoints 8 citizen members, 2 members representing public transit, 1 member representing non-motorized transportation, and 1 member of the Metropolitan Council, as well as their alternates. 14 council-appointed Transportation Advisory Board positions are up for reappointment due to term expirations. 25 applications were received for the 14 open appointments, including alternate positions. Following the interviews, the committee reviewed the application materials and interview notes and made appointment recommendations for the chair's consideration. Therefore, I move that the Metropolitan Council approve appointments to the Transportation Advisory Board tab as shown in the proposed action, and I'm asking for a second.
Second.
It's been seconded by Deb Barber. Is there any discussion on the tab appointments? Deb Barber?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to really commend all of the people who applied for this. We had such a great group of people come forward and seek these positions, and I'm really pleased with the group that we have. We have some new people, brought back some returning incumbents, but I'm just every time so impressed with the people who are interested in participating in this committee. So very happy to see those who are being advanced.
Very good. The tab has a great responsibility, and they do a great job making transportation decisions on behalf of the Met Council and the region. So at this point, I'd like to ask for any other discussion. No further discussion, so let's take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed, nay. That motion carries. Thank you so much. Next, we have business item 2024-13, which is appointment of MAW SAC representative to the White Bear Lake Comprehensive Plan Work Group. Council members, during the 2023 legislative session, the council was awarded $2 million to lead the White Bear Lake Area Comprehensive Plan development. The council is required to establish a work group consisting of the commissioners of Natural Resources, Health, and the Pollution Control Agency, or their designees and representatives from the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee, MASAC. The St. Paul Regional Water Services, the cities within 5-mile radius of White Bear Lake, to advise the council in developing their comprehensive plan. The state agencies, St. Paul Water Resources, and the cities have sent their designee names to be on the work group. The MASAC member is appointed to and by the council. MASAC Chair Wendy Wolf has recommended that MASAC member Phil Klein serve as the representative on the work group, as Mr. Klein is from Hugo, one of the communities represented on the work group, and would be well positioned to represent the interests on this work group. Therefore, I move that the Metropolitan Council approve the appointment of Phil Klein as the Metropolitan Area Water Supply Advisory Committee representative on the White Bear Lake Area Comprehensive Plan Work Group. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded by Wendy Wolf. Is there any discussion? Wendy?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would just say Phil Klein is a council member in Hugo, and he's been on MASAC for quite some time and is well-versed in the work there. He has also been kind of the perennial vice chair of LUAC during the time that I have been the chair of LUAC, so he's well-positioned to represent the group.
That's great. Good to have that support. So if there isn't any further discussion, let's take a vote. All in favor? Aye. Opposed? Nay, that motion carries. We have one more business item, which is 2023-19, and that's appointments to the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission with a motion to amend a previously adopted action. Council members, this motion to amend this previously approved action will correct the term end dates for the recently approved Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commissioners made on December 10th, 2023. For 2023-305, where there was an inadvertent mistake made by council staff. Therefore, I move that the Metropolitan Council approve the following appointments to the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission. with the amended term end dates to fill the open commissioner seats that resulted from redistricting. The following terms run until the first Monday in January 2027, with its chair as Tony Yaruso, District A Representative Monica Dillenberg, District B Bob Moeller, District C Tess Buska, and that the Metropolitan Council approve the following appointments to Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission for the following terms that run until the first Monday in January 2025, with District E represented by Chris Sorig and District F by Cicely Harris, District G by Anthony Taylor, and District H by Amanda Durr. Is there a second?
Second.
It's been seconded. Is there any discussion? With no discussion, I'd like to take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Nay. That motion carries. We have information item next with 2 items. We will first hear from Kristen Ryba Turris and Sarah Henriksen with 2040 indicator project updates and next steps. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. Happy New Year. I think we can still say that, it's only the 10th. For the record, I am Kristen Rybatura's manager in the Community Development Research Department. Here today with Sarah Henriksen, my colleague and senior researcher on our team. We're glad to be here today to talk about indicators work. You know, as we've been tuning into the conversations that you've had with our colleagues about the regional vision and values and policy direction for Imagine 2050, we've heard comments along the way expressing interest in how we track progress, how we tell the story of the council's impact. And so it's great to be having this first direct conversation, and we thank you for your time and attention today. I just want to call out that this is an introductory conversation. I'm sure we could spend an entire meeting on it, and we may, but today we really just prepared a brief presentation, and we're focusing that presentation on 3 learning themes that we've developed from implementation of 2 2040 indicator projects and a broad assessment of indicator projects at regional peer agencies and within our local jurisdictions, and we'll pull some of those examples forward today. And we're also going to associate some opportunities that we see with Imagine 2050 to the learning themes and kind of explore what that could look like for future indicator projects. So briefly, sorry, our slides are out of order. Before we dig in a little bit deeper, I just wanted to do a ground-setting note on terms, because in this work, there are a lot of terms that get used interchangeably: measures, metrics, outcomes, et cetera. So just to be clear, as we talk about regional indicators today, we're referring to those broad population-level data that provide important context about what's happening in our region at scale. So they're descriptive, and they are really the big needles that we want to see move in the region, but they're also the things that are the hardest to see move in the region. Also in this bucket, we would put community indicators. Usually those are describing smaller geographies than our metro or region level, but same bucket. By performance measures, we are talking about information that are describing specific actions the council takes regarding its operations, services, policies, things we have more control over. This is sort of in the vein of key performance indicators. So just wanted to make that distinction.
So to ground us as we think about this work and its purpose, we want to discuss why we measure or track or evaluate. And it's all about answering the question that Thrive phrased as, what does success look like? Or alternatively, are we making a difference and how? So indicator projects invite us to get specific about the results that we seek and express that to our stakeholders, to stay attuned to whether our strategies are effective or if we need to change course, and also to have a shared understanding of what is happening in the region. And this is helpful for many reasons, one of which is that it can lead to better, more productive conversations with community members. So ultimately, indicator work is important because it builds trust with our stakeholders and the region's residents.
So the two indicator projects that were initiated with the adoption of our last regional development guide in 2014 are the Thrive MSP 2040 indicators and the Housing Policy Plan indicators. We've just summarized some background information about both of those projects here. And in our information item document, there's a detailed list of the indicators for each of those projects, as well as noting any departures we made from the originally adopted indicator. We have recently updated this information. It will be live shortly if it isn't already. We won't be looking at this data together today, both in the interest of time. I'm excited to hear Matt Sense's presentation, and I hope you are as well, but also because there is a lot of data here, and much of it was provided to us by other council staff. So we would probably want to direct your questions to them versus trying to, answer your questions poorly. But we do invite you to take a look at this information, to reach out to us with questions if you do have them, and if we are interested in discussing this data together, we are happy to work with you on that. So just moving into our first learning theme, which is that this work is about dialogues and not just data. Indicator projects we assume to be fairly linear, right? We figure out what we want to measure, we assess the data, we select the indicators, and then we publish it and share it and talk about it. But in our experience, and you all may have experienced this as well, because these are not unique pitfalls they're not unique to the council, but they are pitfalls that are commonly experienced with indicator projects. We can fall short in a number of ways. So one sort of characterization would be analysis paralysis, right? So we assess the available data, we select the indicators, but we burn up all of our energy and interest in doing that. We're trying to find this perfect collection of information that's going to tell us everything we need to know about how we're doing. And then by the time we actually complete that process, we're not as interested in the result, which I know sounds counterintuitive, but it does happen. Another example is we did it, now what? So it's not uncommon to complete the data side of an indicators project, but then we've not thought about really how to operationalize it, how to keep it alive and in front of us and use it. Who should use the information when, and how do we create systems for that? So in that scenario, our indicators exist, but they're just fading into the background because of lack of attention. And then we have the, okay, we did it, and it's marginally useful sometimes approach or outcome. This can happen for a number of reasons. When we limit ourselves to only available data, right, just the easy grabs, we're going to make some compromises. And sometimes we make so many compromises along the way that when we take a step back and look at the information, it's a little away from the purpose of the indicator or the outcome we're trying to measure. Another reason can be not making clear connections between our regional indicators and our performance outcomes. So we just have a lot of information, but we're not able to make a lot of sense out of it. So I would say that there were touches of all of these trajectories in our 2040 work, and there doesn't have to be. Thinking about what would most improve our projects. It's really about activating the conversation and creating that detailed roadmap for indicators and their discussion inside the council and outside the council. So we've got very thoughtful and robust engagement efforts underway for our Imagine 2050 plan, and I think this well positions us for indicators work, and I want to call out two particular efforts. First, the top portion of the slide that you're seeing is the centering equity component of the equity framework that you heard about in the fall. And this details a lot of existing partnerships, new partnerships, so we are activated in this conversation, and I think that provides an opportunity to do so with our indicators. How do we continue to collaborate with these folks on identifying that, the shared understanding of progress, and making sure that we're complementing each other's efforts, and then convening frequently to discuss how things are going in the region. And then additionally, our research colleague Darcy Vandergrift shared with you in November some of the initial results of our engagement data and how it will be used. And I just wanted to call out that we're specifically asking folks during these engagements about metrics and success, and what does that look like? What does that feel like to you? And so as we think about bringing in those lived experiences and creating nuance to our regional indicators, which they typically lack that, but we're learning about what is going to resonate out in the communities.
So we have pulled together some examples from other jurisdictions for you today, like Kristen mentioned. One example of an agency that really uses and creates dialogue with their indicator work is Seattle with their Equitable Community Development Monitoring Program. The city was very transparent and engaging when selecting their indicators for this project. Some of the key stakeholders that they worked with include staff at the city, county, and region level, elected officials, residents, and local experts working in areas like public health and public schools. The city's efforts included workshops, surveys, interviews, and focus groups, and the final report clearly outlines the selection criteria and the context for these indicators, why they were chosen, and it also has a comprehensive description of their engagement efforts and what they heard from their residents. The city's ongoing indicator work includes both regular updates, as you would expect, but it also includes gathering feedback about the indicators, how they can be improved, and how to best continue reporting on these measures. So it really creates an ongoing dialogue about this work. And because of the engagement and community buy-in with this effort, these indicators are used not only as a tool for the city, but for everyone in the community to better understand growth and progress in Seattle.
So our next learning theme is the importance of frameworks. Frameworks are crucial. Looking back, we see in our 2040 indicator projects that there were some selection criteria for identifying indicators and some broad organizing principles. So we wanted them to be associated with each of the 5 aspirational outcomes in Thrive. There were 20 specific strategies that were looked at, and each indicator is roughly related to one of those strategies. And we were also mindful about just the scope of the project and the data availability. And those are all sensible and practical considerations, but it's not really a framework. We didn't articulate the connections across regional indicators or between our regional indicators and our performance measures. So absent that, it made completing some of the indicators a little tricky. And I just wanted to share a quick example because I realize that sounds kind of abstract. One example is non-residential redevelopment. So this was identified as an indicator, but you won't actually see it in our dashboard that we have published. We're still working on how exactly to operationalize it. So this is the documentation, or this is sort of how it was spelled out in the selection. So prosperity and equity, encouraging redevelopment and infill were the strategies, and then you see the what and the why it matters there. But as us researchers started to unpack this and think about how we could operationalize it and complete a time series that would show change, we ended up with a lot more questions, not uncommon. But some of those questions were, are we looking at all redevelopment in the region? Should we be focused on specific areas? How do we break this down a little bit? Are we looking at, or should we be thinking specifically about the region's industrial sites, which we want to actually preserve? So looking at what happens with particular types of redevelopment, and then the same use redevelopment, does that count? Does it not count? What's sort of the threshold for what we want to call redevelopment, right? So there's a lot of things that we didn't specify. And we think that a framework that really lays out how non-residential redevelopment, or any topic really, is intersecting with our different policy and system areas, and really getting specific about what we're looking at and how we're going to do it, that would have improved this particular measure.
Our example for this learning theme actually comes from within our region. Ramsey County has both performance measures and community indicators that they track. I want to focus here on their community indicators, which were developed with community engagement and were adopted in 2022. But the key thing that Ramsey County does is they have a framework of how their policies, strategies, and actions interact, how they work together to achieve an objective, and in this case, it's upward mobility. These frameworks help break down the linear and kind of siloed thinking of fixing one thing, X, whatever that may be, will mean that we meet Y goal, whatever that is. But in reality, one data point, one measure doesn't tell the whole story. As policymakers, when we use frameworks, it sets us up to think about how things are connected and consider how strategies, actions, and indicators function in the appropriate context and not in a vacuum.
So thinking about opportunities for frameworks and 2050, there are pieces in place right now that I think lend themselves to a consideration of frameworks. So we've identified 5 regional goals for Imagine 2050. They're listed here. And we're also having this conversation right now in the midst of the policy development process. So there's plenty of time to map how specific policies relate to these goals, how they relate with each other. Like we're at the right part of the process to be able to develop frameworks and think through this so that we can have a better indicator project for any of the policy areas and the plan overall. Oh, one more upside to frameworks. Sorry, forgot something. They can also make that indicator selection easier. And I say that because we'll have a conceptual basis for what it is we want to measure, because sometimes the data that we have available today isn't available in 5 years. So that's just the nature of this work, and if we are very clear on the articulation of what we hope to see, that makes swapping out those sources easier. Last learning theme is about setting targets. So our 2040 indicator projects, they moved away from target setting, though we did want to note that we saw target setting in the 2030 Regional Development Framework that included both baselines and targets, quite specific ones, I might add. But instead, 2040 indicator projects really relied more on characterizing an indicator and its progress by its broad directional trend. But this can have downsides. So here is another example. So this is an indicator that I think is in both projects. It's about new affordable housing construction region-wide. And, if I were here and presenting an annual update to you and we were talking about, how is this going compared to last year? As you can see, it would be a little bit of a roller coaster because, as you know, development, looks like this. But broadly, the overall trend is that there is increased affordable housing production in the region, which is great. And we might characterize that as positive or progress and so forth. But I want you to look at the same chart with a target. So here we've added it's a fake target, but we've added the allocation of affordable housing need, which is a region-wide number that communities plan around. And we've just annualized that so we can show what number of affordable units would we need to produce each year to reach that goal at the end of the decade. And I think it creates some context for how we're doing. Certainly the trend has gone up and that's great, but we are still falling short of where we need to be to hit the goal. One other point to make here is that we didn't officially identify a baseline year for any of our indicator work for 2040 projects. And so we start a lot of our time series for this work at 2014 because that's when Thrive was adopted. But it's particularly in housing and employment measures, the impacts of the Great Recession were still seen in our 2014 data. And so sort of by default or by, how that emerged, a lot of things would just improve over time regardless. And so we need to be thoughtful about what we're benchmarking to.
We actually have 2 examples for this learning theme. The first comes from the state's One Minnesota plan, which you all are likely familiar with. We've included an example here on the slide. I did want to note that the goal is in percent of budget and the graph is in actual dollars. But you can see how the state sets a target and tracks progress with that goal for reference. So the council has created its own strategic plan that relates to One Minnesota, and we as a council have set measurable goals for 2027 as part of this effort. So we're kind of already following this model, but we can build on this foundation and set targets for other measures. Really track our progress and highlight what we are working toward and when we hope to achieve it. Our last example of setting targets comes from CMAP in Chicago. They have integrated indicators into their 2050 regional plan in a very robust way. They have a dashboard and an appendix that are regularly updated, and they generally have a lot of transparency and discussion of this work. But we can see here that CMAP also sets targets like we saw in One Minnesota, and it measures progress towards those targets. But one thing we did want to highlight here is that there are different ways that we can set targets. So some peer agencies like Chicago set both short-term and long-term goals. Some peer agencies set more aggressive targets in some situations and less aggressive targets in others. So there is flexibility in how we want to do this. It's really up to us and our stakeholders to decide what makes the most sense for us as a council. Okay, we've covered a lot of information in this presentation. Some of it is pretty concrete and some of it more abstract. So we've collected our main takeaways for you on this slide. We really want to highlight the fact that indicator work can be a helpful and instructive tool if it is used and supported. This work can really benefit our residents and our stakeholders in addition to the council. It can help everyone better understand progress in the region, and it can lead to actions that better align with our goals across the region. We also want to highlight that when we use frameworks, we have a clearer picture of how policies and actions interact and how these can work together to achieve our goals. We do know that no one data point is perfect, no indicator is perfect, but frameworks allow us to have a more holistic understanding, which leads to more helpful and instructive measurement. And finally, setting targets creates a clear understanding of what we are hoping to achieve and when we hope to achieve it, really defining what success actually looks like for our residents. And not only highlights areas where we may need to adjust a strategy or an action to achieve our goals, but the targets also serve as a call to action for our stakeholders. By being very clear about our efforts and our targets, others in the region can more easily align their work and support the council as we work toward our regional goals.
So fair to say that we've critiqued our 2040 approach, but there is good news too, and good news outside of even the work we're doing for Imagine 2050. We're in a very different position than we were 10 years ago doing this work. And I just want to highlight some of the ways in which that, that we think about that. So we have, research, right? We have new data sources and methods that we're excited about. Here I've just listed a couple of data sets that we didn't have when Thrive was adopted. So there's always new and innovative information coming out that we can leverage into our indicator work. Again, easier to do with frameworks. So we're really excited about being able to leverage some of that information now. That also I would say includes our qualitative research. So how can we incorporate qualitative research in indicator work, not just to activate the conversations, but to actually think about how to incorporate those as measures. It is possible, but it's new and different, but we have the right folks in place and the capacity in place. And then also just thinking, kind of in a more practical sense, perhaps, databases and software, other reporting systems. We've come a long way. A lot of departments have done the heavy lifting of organizing their information so that they can do reporting and not spend a lot of time doing data gathering. So a great example of that is MTS's Transportation System Performance Evaluation. It's a digital report. It's packed with data and information. And this is all sort of automated and organized so that it can be updated, and it's just a great example. And then lastly, I'll just say this. As we were talking with folks and requesting data to update our indicators with, we heard a lot of passion for continuous improvement and for storytelling about the great work that we do. And so I think there is a shared passion and interest for this work, but we also shouldn't underestimate what's ahead. It's going to take a lot of effort to knit all of the pieces together. And so we may have all of the pieces now, which is awesome, but putting them together is also a lot of effort. And so, now is the time to talk measurement. We are talking measurement. Again, we're in the very front end of 2024 here. While policy development is underway, you're going to have folks bringing policy objectives to you and talking about the specifics behind everything. So it is a great time to be thinking about that, about measurement as that work is brought to you. We have a couple questions that we crafted today. I'm not sure where we're at in terms of time on the agenda, but we're open to hearing any reactions you have to things we shared today, and ideas you might have for activating dialogues. How do you want to be involved or engaged in this work as it moves forward? So with that, I turn it back to you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kristen and Sarah. That was a very interesting report. I can see that a lot of work has been put into it. It's very thoughtful, and I'd like to hear from council members if you have any discussion or questions. Councilmember Tony Carr.
So I'm still organizing my thoughts, but thank you very, very much for the presentation, for the background, and a perspective on what opportunities we may have and also pitfalls that we want to avoid along the way as we think about our 2050 plan, what we want to see and how we understand whether we're getting there. I was going to say, are we there yet? We probably won't quite be there yet in terms of where we want to be ultimately. But I love the concept of the short and long term, and want to make sure that as we're thinking about our regional development guide and guiding toward where we want to be, we are checking our steps along the way. I was also really, really glad to hear as you spoke about the manner in which indicators were or had been derived in the past and the work you're doing now. You're talking about the checking in with people in our community for whom life should look different if we achieve some of these goals. So I really very, very much appreciate that already is starting, and would just encourage that we develop a process of knowing how we continue to do that, along the way, so that we're getting the experience, the perspective from that lived experience, and helping to pick our indicators and, understand whether or not we've got the right ones. But so that we also have a real discussion about what that means along the way. How do we stay centered? How do we check and validate, that this is what we heard and that we're continuing to adhere in our work to what was said, and that we're reporting back to those from whom we drew this information on a regular basis and over both the short and long term of our work. So I really do appreciate hearing that in the first place, but I think there's some real development that we will need to do to make certain that that's real for us and that it remains real as we're writing the plan and as we're experiencing the work along the way. I think I also see light in the work that you have checked into and are reporting back on. The examples that you showed from Seattle, from Ramsey County, from Chicago, which are really relevant in informing the work that we do. I am really encouraged that we set in place as soon as possible our desires, and that those desires are really about what changes for people. I noted, and I know we're not going to talk about the data or the indicators from 2040, but I did note that there's a whole section of indicators in the housing plan, for example, that were taken out and that they were very specific to start with. I think they were numbers like 2 through 6 or so in the housing plan. And they were very specific. And in that middle column, it says they were no longer in use. And then there's some very general, more regional indicators that seem to have taken their place in that third column. So I do want to not ask questions about numbers or the indicators, the specific indicators themselves, but I want to understand that what we are working toward is what changes for people, and how do we make certain that we don't think the region is an entity in and of itself, but that we acknowledge that the region is the collection of people that are here with us. And so our indicators ought also always to point to what's changing for people, because that is what drives the change for the region overall. Forgive me for the tons of gobbledygook as I try to organize my thoughts. Hope you heard something in that we're really focusing in this, our discussion of the RDG for the Regional Development Guide for 2050 on the changes for people. Thank you.
Very good comments, Tony Carter. I know that you have a great deal of interest, as we all do, on the Regional Development Guide and how we're developing the 2050 plan. Very good points, and I too was looking at the housing portion of the indicators, and I think if there is something that is pulled out, maybe just kind of putting an asterisk and an addendum or something, so we could see a little bit more about why and the impacts, and I think that would be very helpful. So very good comments. Councilmember Vento?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both very much. This was a very well-organized and presented presentation. I would ask that as we move forward on this, that we remember that we've got some pretty small communities and townships that we need to make sure our indicators and our conversations and our words are relevant to them. I'm not suggesting in any way that we dummy it down. Some might hear that in my remarks. I'm not. What I'm asking is that we be as inclusive as possible so that those of us who represent those communities can go out and really have good conversations where we don't have to scramble to try and make it relevant for them, but that from the get-go, we've got something that everybody in the region can embrace, wrap their arms around, and work off of. Thank you.
Member Lee.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Not a question, just a commendation. I really appreciate all the hard work that the research department does and continues to do. When the staff come before the Equity Advisory Committee, the staff are always very open-minded and having a real dialogue with community members. And so I appreciate and commend the research staff. For folks listening at home, if you ever need any sort of data sets, you can contact the research department and ask for them.
Need more work to do.
Got it.
Okay, we're going to get a flood of people contacting the research department. That's wonderful. Any other comments? I see Pacheco and Lilligren.
Yes, Madam Chair, and when you were looking at what's here today and how things can jump up, I was at a meeting the other day, and I think Hennepin County reported that now 30-some% of their emergency housing is now refugees. And people think that's in Chicago and New York, but it's growing here as well. And we have started looking at the future of how we're going to, what our role in addressing that, the change is going to be. And I find it interesting that the, looking at 2050, at 2050 I'll be 100. So I've kind of looking at, well, I have to sort of plan my way around this thing here.
Okay, Lilligren?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks for this work. I mean, this is really fascinating, and as we are setting our sights on our 2050 plan and doing the work under Councilmember Tony Carter's leadership, establishing the 2050 regional design guidelines, this is going to be very, very helpful. And I just love how Councilmember Tony Carter frames things in her comments, and you so often say what I want to say, but you say it in such a better way. But the one thing that I really wanted to lift up from Councilmember Carter's comments, and this kind of relates to what I do in my day job, and we engage stakeholders, community partners, and And so to your questions about what are my hopes for the 2050 indicator projects, and also to the indicators and measurements and during implementation, I would hope that came from the people, the communities that were engaging, the stakeholders that were engaging, and we can really see that. And so sometimes it's hard to say, oh, this is how we're going to do it, because we need those voices and those perspectives within the process before we can really know where we're headed. And so that's what I took from what you said, Councilmember Carter, and that's what I would really love to see going forward. Thanks.
Thank you. Councilmember Johnson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is my 5th year, and this is still just an immense amount of work and just trying to absorb it all, right? So hats off to you guys. So 2 things, maybe to Councilmember Vento's point, and I've been saying this kind of lately, as you are out engaging, if you are in, I'm gonna speak for myself, my district, or meeting with many of my folks, can you just ping me and let me know? I don't necessarily have to be in the meeting. I just like to know who in my area has been met with, talked to, done a survey, I guess engaged with us, because then when I'm out there meeting with them, I can talk to them about that, see how their experience was, and just, get a frame of reference on, how much my district is engaging, and I'm sure others would appreciate that as well. So that is an ask. I think I've asked this 4 or 5 times now of various departments, and I would like to see that council-wide if possible. Just a ping, somebody from the community or whatever we're meeting with, they filled out a survey, they're on a task force, whatever, that'd be great. And then back to the indicators. So my reference, of course, with indicator is Met Council, but before that, it was with Greater MSP. And so are we still working with Greater MSP? I know they glean a lot of data from everything that they're doing. And are they still doing their regional indicators project? I think the first year they did that was 2015, and that was really to track our competitiveness as a region, not just nationally, but globally. And it was surfacing all the disparities that we know, of course. So are we still partnered with them in this work, and especially as it relates to the health and well-being of people, but also the health and well-being of our economy and how resilience plays into that and other factors. And also for Center for Economic Inclusion. So I just, or the U or whoever, are we synced up with them as much as we can be, where we're sharing data that we are all on a macro level tracking and measuring and gauging together?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson, there are definitely active connections to both of those organizations, and both of those indicator projects are sort of what comes to mind when I think about, kind of higher profile efforts that where we should be complementing each other's data work and, convening together to talk about how, different takes on unpacking the information. I know that we are in the midst of updating some of the information pulled together for the regional economic framework.
Yeah.
Both organizations were involved in helping us with that. So I suspect we'll be in touch with them. I don't know when the last time Greater MSP updated their regional indicator dashboard. I think it was 2021. And so, we will certainly touch base with them. They're, that's exactly the kind of sort of coordination and conversation that we want to make sure that we're a part of, so that, number one, we're not duplicating things. If we all have a slightly different way of measuring something, that's kind of confusing. But those are both, and I would say the Center for Economic Inclusion's indicator work is top-notch. Really appreciate the level of disaggregation that they've included there, and we'll certainly want to be in conversation with them about how to frame up some of that for 2050. Absolutely.
And thank you, Madam Chair, if I may. Thank you for that. I think being very intentional with those partnerships and relationships is important, because we can't be a fragmented region, and we have great researchers at all of those organizations and more, of course. And again, to your point, wherever we can share data, level set with data that we specifically want to reference at a high point, because we're not the only policymakers across the region, right? We want the other policymakers to be looking at the same data, essentially, generally, that we are, so that we are all on the same page, including our local governments. So I like to lift that up to keep in mind, because certainly Council is not a siloed organization. And to Councilmember Lee's point, preeminent group here that does excellent research work and is a great source for data across the region and beyond. But I think, again, it's really important with Greater MSP's mission to, work on our economic competitiveness, which goes into workforce, which gets down then into layers of housing and education and all of those things and those huge disparities that continue to exist that we know about. I just want to make sure that we're linked up in some intentional way. And I know they were doing a lot of convenings early on when then Peter Frosch, before he became CEO, was building all of this with his team. So I guess my thoughts are that whatever we build, it translates, across the region so that others are, to the best of our ability, on the same page with us and they can understand it. And we boil down all this information into the high-level indicators that everybody can agree to, and then the people that are super, super duper smart like you can dig down into the details. So, and I don't know how much of this ever really gets looked at by the legislature, but it'd be pretty cool if they knew the hard work that goes into this, and it's more than a snapshot. It's a deep dive into what's really going on to this region. So those are my only thoughts right now. I'm not being very helpful, I'm sure, but I look forward to the next steps as we proceed.
Well, thank you. I know Councilmember Carter wanted to say something, but I feel compelled to say that I really like a lot of the elements that were presented today. The keyword interconnectedness and partnership, I think, ties into what you've been saying, Councilmember Johnson. And I also like the fact that we're not stopping at implementation, that there's the assessment and the evaluation, which I know is critical for continuous improvement. I don't know if that's incorporated into the timeline, but if that could be either at the beginning or the end, and then have that assessment evaluation point highlighted, I think that would be helpful as well. Councilmember Carter?
I just wanted to respond briefly to the point the council member just made regarding the work that's been done with Greater MSP and Center for Economic Inclusion, the regional development framework that actually does set a tone for looking into the future. And fortunately, in our last regional development work group, we did hear, and the council will be getting a report on this work very soon, that at the foundation of that work and to be included in the regional development guide is the summary of work that was done in collaboration with Greater MSP and CEI and the Metropolitan Council. So you're spot on. And of course, you are also a part of that group. We knew you had a conflict at the last meeting. You'll be glad to know that we talked about that.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, and we'll look forward to updating the rest of the team on it as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Very good. I'd also like to add that, again, Judy's talked about the fact that we talked with MSP early on, and they had a big meeting that Met Council had a lot of participation in. If there are meetings like that Greater MSP or our partners are having that were mentioned today, like Center for Economic Inclusion, I think there are several of us council members that would like to be informed and possibly even participate. Okay, moving on, we have another item. Thank you for your presentation today.
These are great.
Our second item will be lessons and resources from the 2020 census presented by Matt Schrader. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair and council members. For the record, I am Matt Schroeder from the Community Development Research Team, here today to talk about 2020 census data that, while not new, because we're talking about 2020 and 2024, is maybe new to some of you. To sort of set the stage for this a bit, in August 2021, the Census Bureau released its first batch of data from the 2020 census, and that was for redistricting purposes, so it did not include a lot of information. If you want to see more of that, that was a presentation probably October 6th of 2021, and it's linked in the excuse me, the slides. But today, we'll be talking about data that came out last year in 2023. So in May, they released additional detail on age and sex, detail on household and family relationships and household types, and then finally data on tenure, whether people rent or own their home. And then just a few months ago in September, they also released data that has not really been available before on detailed racial and ethnic groups that go beyond those major race and ethnic categories. So those are things that I'll talk about today. But just as a reminder, the richer, more detailed information about people like education, veteran status, disability, and so on is not available in the decennial census. That's only in the American Community Survey, which, different product. Excuse me. So the main topics, as I mentioned, from the data released last year are age and household type and home ownership rates. And I am eternally optimistic about what can be covered in a certain amount of time. I'm going to try to, in the interest of time, try to kind of speed through things that are better known, and trends that you've already talked about before, to get to the things that are probably newer. So, and one of those might be disaggregating all of these topics by race, just those general major race and ethnic groups like white and black and Asian and so on. And then later, to look at population counts of those more detailed race groups within all of those major groups, so the Mexican, Hmong, Somali, and so on. And this is the data that has not really been out before. Excuse me again. So first, age, and I will try to go through this quickly since you've talked about this at length in various presentations before, but matters for, well, in all ways, workforce, what our government needs to be doing to care for people, and what our healthcare system needs to be set up for, and so on. So yeah, I mean, as you've talked about before, our population is getting older. So I think the main thing to look at here is the dark orange bar portion of these charts, which shows the share of the population that is at least age 65. And that's increased from 11% as recently as 2010 to 15% in 2020. And I think more recent Census Bureau estimates have put this at around, 16, maybe 17%. So this really is continuing to increase as baby boomers really hit the retirement age. And just as context too, what I think you've talked about before, our most recent regional forecast for 2050 is anticipating that this share will rise to 22% in the next 25 years. So yeah, big part of planning too. But, and you can see this as well in median age statistics too, which have risen steadily over the years. But as always, it's really important to keep in mind the variation within these overall totals. So you can see that, again, with that darker orange shade, 19% of our white residents are age 65 or older, compared with much smaller proportions of other groups. So while I cannot see, it's about 6% Black, maybe, 6% of Asian Pacific Islander, 4% of Hispanic Latino residents, and so on. And again, that shows up in the median ages too. So yes, even though our population is aging and it has a lot of implications for housing, the economy, health, and so on, we still do have a lot of kids that we need to take care of, especially given that almost half, I think, of kids under 5 are people of color. So yes, population growing older, 1/7 of the region's residents are at least 65, and then important to keep in mind that the white population is, on average, older. Turning now to household types, this, as I think you've talked about too, really, especially household sizes, influences the demand for different types of housing. So are we really accommodating larger households, for example, at a variety of price points for both ownership and rental housing, and community dynamics as well? I mean, a neighborhood with mostly people who live alone is going to look really different from a neighborhood with mostly families with kids, and neither is better than the others. It's just a different character. So we can look from this data at changes in household types, variation in household size, and then for the first time in decennial census data, same-sex couple households. So a trend that I know you've talked about before, we have fewer households with kids. So over the past decade, in 2010 to 2020, that rightmost column, we lost about 15,000 families with kids, that darkest blue shade, at the same time that we gained 82,000 families without kids. This doesn't mean that families with kids are fleeing the region and a lot of families without kids are moving in. It just means that we have probably more empty nester households as kids leave their parents' houses. These households transition from families with kids to being without kids, but still is a really prominent trend. And now I think for the first time, at least since 1990, probably well before that, we have more families without kids than families with kids. And of course, we've also gained households of one person and other non-family households, so people who are not related but live together.
Madam Chair, can I ask a
Yes,
question?
go ahead.
Thank you. How do you define kids? Is it 18 and under? Because there's a lot of kids in their 20s that are living with their parents.
All right, Madam Chair, Councilmember Wolf, that is a good point. These kids would be under 18. So I will have to double check that, actually. It may depend on the relationships among different people in the household, but I believe it's kids under 18.
That's a good question, because I was thinking maybe having it broken down or maybe having another chart that splits out the families without kids, if we could somehow see the ages of the adults in the household to see if there are a lot of seniors without kids, because I know that impacts that light blue number. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my thought on this, as you were reporting out, are the kids just aging into the dark green section of living alone? Or starting their own family, however that is defined? And I just have to say, I have grandkids. I would like more. And yet, I just, sorry, kids, but I'm learning from them. And it's just interesting, there's a generation out there that is paying very close attention to how much it costs to raise a child in a very difficult economy to even afford rent or buy a home or secure the job that, and this is, I'm talking about kids who had a good education coming out of my household, right? So that in and of itself worries me. There are economic pressures, at least from a sphere that I'm looking at, that are informing whether or not they should have children. And I don't know how that might show up in data. It might be more just informative through anecdotal evidence, but it's economic pressures and what it can do, to familial status and, and the pressures of income. And so I just have to figure that out in my own family. But if it's true in a sphere, maybe there are others experiencing that, I don't know. But we're hearing that more and more people are waiting longer to get married, choosing not to get married, maybe not choosing to have a family until they're older or not at all. And I'm just trying to figure out, beyond my own experience, how does that show up in data, and how long of a trend is that? Millennials, or is that Gen X that are coming up? It's a phenomenon I'd like to better understand.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Councilmember Johnson, that is probably part of the reason why birth rates have continued to decline. They've bounced back a little bit since COVID, but there's been a longer-term decline in birth rates. And so, I think too, an increase in the share of households who are grandparents living with their kids, but I think without, as primary responsibility, primary caretakers for their kids. And so, yeah, it's a difficult world out there.
Thank you. I think that was a really good question, and I was curious about it as well for similar reasons, and also understanding both the cultural and the economic impacts that are affecting these trends would be very interesting to know. Councilmember Vento?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to piggyback a little bit on Councilmember Johnson, I don't have kids or grandkids, but if any of you have so many grandkids that you need to unload them temporarily, I'd be happy to step in.
What'd you ask for?
Thank you, Councilmember. I'm a good babysitter. Learned at an early age. I'm curious, kind of throughout this presentation, Matt, where if you have any observations as to how that pandemic may have influenced some of this data. And if you're not prepared to answer that tonight, maybe in a future presentation. Because I keep kind of thinking back to, would this have been different had there not been shut down and all sorts of change going on in terms of people's lives and lifestyles? Thanks.
Yeah, Madam Chair and Councilmember Vento, thank you for that question. I meant to mention before that I guess there are two ways that that might show up. One is in the data itself, the numbers, the patterns of household types and so on. The other is how the pandemic affected the collection of this data in the first place. And yeah, we know that undercoverage rates were a lot higher for, I believe, Hispanic or Latino groups and American Indian and Native Americans living on reservations than they had been in the past. And children, babies under 1 year old continue to be undercounted as well. But this year, I think, produced substantial challenges, of course, that the Census Bureau stopped field enumeration for several weeks. And then the political atmosphere as well kind of contributed to lower response rates, and then the longer phase of gathering data stretching out into, I believe, September. Even though the date of the census that you're supposed to answer for is April 1st, if people are answering 6 months later, that gets a little trickier. So yeah, I would say because this happened in the very early phases of the pandemic, before death rates really started to peak later in 2020 and 2021, the numbers themselves, the patterns that we see in the data are probably not driven as much by the pandemic itself, but the collection of data and therefore the people who show up in the data, yes, I mean, I think it's pretty clear that that was affected in some way. But again, there's no perfect census and they do the best they can, but yeah, there were difficulties.
Very good insights and information. Other questions? Go ahead.
Can you remind us how close Minnesota came to losing a congressional district? My notes show that it was 3.5 people per congressional district. Like if each congressional district reported 3.5 less people, I don't know what half of a person is, but 3.5 less people per congressional district, we would have gone from 8 to 7.
Wow.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Lindstrom, that sounds about right. It depends on whether you look at the number of people who, if Minnesota had X number of people fewer, or whether you look at if New York had Y number of people more. It's a complicated formula. But yeah, I think if Minnesota had 27 fewer people then, which would be about 3.5 people per district, then yeah, we would have lost our 8th congressional seat. So compliments to all of the people who tried to get out our response rate, including community groups.
Well, we have our researcher here, Matt, so if anybody else has any interesting questions, let's throw them at him. Okay, Pacheco.
Madam Chair, members, well, it's what I mentioned earlier was the growth of the refugee community coming here today. And that bodies were counted for census, not whether you're a citizen or not. And all that was challenged all the way through till the election, I think. And the number of children per household. Now, when I grew up, I had 3 brothers, 3 sisters, and I don't even know how many cousins lived right around me. And when you're paying when your school's funding formula comes per child, whether it's $14,000 or whatever, that high school in Austin, Minnesota really likes a family of 7. Otherwise, they may lose that school And so I think when you're looking at how this is going to play out, there's so many dynamics that are there. And I, like you, I look back and say, how did someone handle 7 kids at home? No one shy. And so I don't know how they did it either. But anyway, so I think that those things play, and that's a big chunk of people these days. We're moving around this earth, so.
Indeed, it is a complicated world. There will be much more material to, excuse me, ask questions on. Happy to answer whatever you have, though. So, but again, important to remember that households of color are larger. We do still have many households that are larger. So the average household size looking across the total population is 2.5. For white and non-Latino households, it's 2.24. For Black households, 2.98, and so on. So we do have much higher average household sizes. We do have much higher rates of multi-generational households, so a little over 9% for Asian and Pacific Islander households. And then looking again at that darker orange shade, the share of households with 5 or more people, it goes from 7% for non-Latino households up to 24% for Asian and Pacific Islander households. And someone mentioned, I think, both cultural and economic factors in this, and both of those are at play here. It is more of a cultural norm for some people to have multiple generations in one house and to live in larger households. And other times, I mean, there are economic pressures to double up, even if you might prefer to be living separately. So there are many different dynamics at work here, but important to remember still that as we're planning for the housing of the future, accommodating these larger families is still important to keep in mind, even as they get smaller and even as we get more people living alone. And now I promised data on same-sex couple households, which sounds very intriguing, and so I want to disappoint you first by saying that this term actually leaves out a lot. There were no 2020 census questions on sexual orientation or gender identity. We just got this binary male-female option. And so all we can really see is infer, or basically describe same-sex couple households as a male householder with a male spouse or partner and a female householder with a female spouse or partner. So this does not include LGBTQ people who don't live with a partner, who live with a partner in the household of someone else. For example, a transgender man who lives with a female spouse or partner, so or identify as non-binary. That would be a very hard question to answer. So yeah, there is a lot missing from here, but still, it's more data than we've had available in the past, and the Census Bureau is currently actually testing questions on sexual orientation and gender identity, so hopefully we'll have more in the future. But to fill that gap, there is an institute at the UCLA Law School that does produce estimates of the LGBT population and the transgender population. And at least for the state of Minnesota, they've estimated that about 30,000 people are transgender and about 112,000 are LGBT for our 15-county metro area. So at least it fills in a little bit of gaps, but ultimately, yeah, not the quality of data that you'd want. But still, we can at least find out that there are 13,500 same-sex couple households in the Twin Cities, which is about 1% of all households and then 2% of all coupled households, so households where the householder has a spouse or partner. We can also see that about 57% of them are married versus 87% of opposite-sex couple households, but given that, at least in Minnesota, they could not get married until a little over 10 years ago, that no doubt has something to do with that difference there. And we can also look at variation by race, at least these major groups. And so interesting to note that the share of same-sex couple households is a little bit lower for white and Black and Asian households than it is for Hispanic or Latino and American Indian or Indigenous households and households of some other race or more than one race. Looking at where same-sex couple households live in the region, these shares are highest in Minneapolis and especially Golden Valley and the immediate suburbs too. But instructive, I think, to note that they live everywhere in the region, that many suburban edge and rural communities have at least 0.5% of their households that are same-sex couple households. And then we can also look within cities at census tracts, and so South Minneapolis, eastern part of Golden Valley, the northwestern part of North Minneapolis, and so on, have particularly high shares of same-sex couple households. But again, you see them throughout the many communities.
Madam Chair.
Go ahead, Councilmember Johnson.
And if I may infer something, but I want to check the white, I'm looking at one of my cities, Plymouth. The white area could be commercial industrial land where there is no, you know what I mean? Is that true? Because I'm just checking on that. I'm noticing that in that space, it's commercial industrial. So would that just come up, zero out since there's no housing there at all in the map, or no?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson, there are only 3 census tracts in the region that do not have any people living in them. So all of the census tracts that you see here would have at least some housing in them. Not necessarily a lot, but, and yeah, the tracts that are largely commercial and industrial would have fewer households in them. But that lightest shade would also be less than 0.5%, not necessarily 0, but less than 0.5%.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Go ahead. You can continue. Thanks.
So the takeaways from household types, that we have experienced a net decline in families with kids and increases in families without kids and people living alone. But I do think for the questions here, it would be useful to get a more detailed breakdown of families without kids, and I will try to pull that together in the next week or so. Households of color do, though, remain larger than white households and a lot more likely to be multi-generational. And then, as I just mentioned, same-sex couple households are about 2% of all coupled households. But it is, even with those cautions, yeah, it is wonderful to finally have data on same-sex couple households. Turning, I think, really quickly to homeownership, as we've all talked about, it helps people out by resulting in mostly predictable housing costs that are sometimes cheaper than renting, as well as, it's the majority of people's assets, most households' assets, and so it's a primary way to build long-term wealth. I am definitely not arguing that it is the best way or the only way to do that, but practically speaking, this is how America is set up right now. So we can look at trends in homeownership rates by race, homeownership gaps compared with other metro areas, and then a little bit within the region as well. So this is the trend from 1990 to 2020 of the white homeownership rate, which in 2020 was at about 74%, a little bit of a decline from 2010. But then going through other groups, we see a slight rise for Asian households, for households of some other race or more than one race, for Hispanic or Latino households. Pretty much static homeownership rates, for American Indian and Indigenous households. But for Black households, a somewhat noticeable decline from what was already an extremely low homeownership rate to about 25% in 2020. So I know that this has been a topic of conversation very frequently, but I think just to put some numbers to this helps. And so being able to look at our homeownership inequities relative to other metro areas is still, I think, really useful. So these are the homeownership rates for different races in our 15-county metro area. So they differ from the previous slide because that was just the 7-county region. This is the full metro, to be able to compare it to other metros in the country. And then, so those are the rates, and here the green shades are the gaps, so the percentage point difference between homeownership rates of different groups and the white homeownership rate. And as has been the case for a long time, if we did this chart for all of the 25 most populous metro areas and compared the sizes of these green columns, you would find that for our metro, the green boxes for Black households and American Indian or Indigenous households is the largest among those 25 metros, and 5th largest for Asian Pacific Islander households and Hispanic or Latino households. So again, large gaps, and while people will kind of try to explain this away by saying, well, it's really just that our our region has very high homeownership rates as it is. And so if you, it's not that our, it's not that our households of color are doing particularly poorly, it's that our white households are doing particularly well. If that were true, you'd expect to see, looking at the rates of homeownership rather than the gaps, you'd expect to see rates that are relatively high among metro areas too, and that is not the case. The MSP Metro has the lowest homeownership rate among Black households among the 25 most populous metro areas, which has been the case, I think, ever since I've been presenting on this topic. And relatively low rates as well for other groups, except for households of some other race or more than one race. And then looking more at the local context, so we can, I'm going to focus on Black-white gaps here because they are that is the most exceptional pattern that came out of that data. So there are 23 cities with at least 1,000 Black households. There are none of them that have a Black homeownership rate higher than the white homeownership rate.
Can you repeat that?
Yes, there are 0 cities, 0 of those 23 cities with at least 1,000 Black households. None of them has a Black homeownership rate that's larger than the white homeownership rate. So in all of these 23 cities, there's a homeownership gap between white and Black households where white households have a higher rate. In just 3 of these cities, 3 of these cities have a Black homeownership rate of more than 40%, which as context is right about where American Indian and Indigenous households are for the full region, the group with the next highest homeownership rate. But in 17 of these cities, the homeownership gap is more than 40 percentage points. So again, this is very much a local dynamic too, that I know a lot of cities are trying to address. But again, I think helpful to have census data that is as complete as the Census Bureau can make it for local areas, in a way that it's not really available as reliably as for as in between the census years. I should mention too, though, as on a sunny note, that homeownership rates are rising for Black households in a lot of northwest and southern suburbs. So Brooklyn Center, Brooklyn Park, New Hope, Crystal, Robbinsdale, Burnsville, West St. Paul, and so on. So there is some signs of hope.
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Councilmember
thanks
Ullmer.
for pausing. And so are those the areas where we would find those 3 cities that have the Black home ownership rates of more than 40%?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Lilligren, I have that written down somewhere. It is not in front of me. I'm sorry.
All right. It'd be interesting to know.
Yeah, very good question. You can continue unless there's no more questions at this point.
So as we've seen before, homeownership rates have increased for several race groups, decreased slightly for white and Black households, some of the largest racial inequities in homeownership, and that exists on both a regional level and at the local level too. But I do definitely want to get into the data on detailed race and ethnicity, which is what we have not seen before from the Census Bureau. So, I mean, this matters obviously for just the visibility of groups, being able to be seen in the region and having a discernible presence from official data for which a lot of people pay attention to. But beyond that, we as government officials and staff need to know whom we're serving, and especially when we're engaging with communities, important to understand who we're trying to reach so that we can tailor the engagement modes and methods and communication styles to them. And so unfortunately, all we can really look at is the population counts. Little bit of detail on age, but it's not, there's not a lot. So as context here, this is the slide that I've included in presentations for years, which looks at the major race and ethnic groups as defined by the federal government and provides the caution and acknowledgement that each of these groups has a lot of diversity within it, lots of different groups of different social and economic status and characteristics and everything. We can't get you data on them, but they exist. So now at least, we can at least point to different groups. These next slides have some numbers. I'm not going to go through them all, but I'll mention briefly how to go through this slide so that the others will make more sense. So in this data set, the Census Bureau provided both regional groups and detailed groups. Regional groups are for the white groups, things like European, which include people with German, Irish, English, Norwegian backgrounds, people who wrote that in on the census. Other white, primarily people who responded white or Caucasian, and then the Middle Eastern or North African group, which, if you're confused about why that's under the white group, yep, that is how the federal government has set it up. That had a chance of being changed before the 2020 census, but was delayed. And so hopefully it'll happen. But at least being able to get some data on it, even though people have to write it in, is good. So those are the regional groups versus detailed groups. And the following slides have those mentions for the other race groups. But as I said, I don't think there's time to really go through them. But we can look at the most common detailed groups in the region. And as you might expect, these are, what appear most prominently here are the white groups, which are shown in blue, dark blue. And then the detailed groups that fall under the black race group are in green, fall under the Hispanic or Latino group in yellow, and then the Asian group in that kind of pinkish color. I should say too that that people can be counted in more than one of these. So these show the numbers for everyone who identified with this detailed group, regardless of whether they identified as another one. I can't honestly remember how I responded to the 2020 census, but it was probably something like German and Dutch, and if that was true, I would be counted in both the German and the Dutch columns. But then, it's useful too, I think, to look at a smaller scale and eliminate those white groups that just throw off the scale of the previous chart to be able to look only at the detailed groups in race groups other than white. So about 146,000, for example, people who identified as African American, 137,000 people who identified as Mexican, and so on. I should mention just a couple things. One is that there's that third highest group, Black not specified. Those are people who just wrote in their race as Black or did not specify another response. We might see them as African American, but we cannot know for sure, and we don't want to override how people identified. So even though these specific categories kind of dilute the Black population by splitting them into separate groups, unfortunately, it's not really possible to combine them. The second thing I'll mention is that while the Middle Eastern and North African detailed groups are too small to show up on this chart, if we put them all together, not that that's a good idea, but if we did kind of put them all together, they would be the 9th largest group in the region. And then finally, you'll notice all the way over on the right, the 9,300 approximately residents who identify as Chippewa, or wrote in Ojibwe or Anishinaabe, but the Census Bureau calls them Chippewa. That was also kind of diluted, because if people wrote in something like the White Earth Band or the Red Lake Band or the Leech Lake Band, they were classified as separately from just this overall Chippewa category. So that too is kind of diluted, but just some cautions there when looking at this chart. And then finally, we can look at the, within cities, at the residential patterns. And I won't go into this. I mean, the maps basically show it all. But each of these dots on the map represents one person in a given census tract. And so useful to note, I think, that while there are definite, concentrations of African American and Mexican residents, they are definitely prominent throughout the region, whereas to some extent Somali residents, Hmong residents, and particularly Ecuadorian residents, the second largest Hispanic Latino group, shows some more clustering. But possible to look at least in a bit more detail, but and if you'd like to see more groups, let me know. But I do want to emphasize that though the data are imperfect, it still does give us better data than we've had before on the detail and the diversity that we have in the region. And I'll just mention very quickly that We also published just today an interactive tool providing all this data, the age, household type, and home ownership rates data on the web today. Kristen is not just a plan our indicators. She also oversees our web presence too. And so, yeah, she and her team, especially Raven McKnight, have worked pretty hard on this. So grateful to them for getting this out. But it provides lots of different topics, the ones that I discussed here, except for the detailed race groups, which came out too late, but also for multiple geographies. So the classics, the counties, cities, and townships, and so on, but also things that aren't typically available, like Minneapolis and St. Paul neighborhoods, and the political districts that are post-redistricting, so the new districts for council districts, of course, but also state legislative districts, wards, and precincts. So these are not available anywhere else. Census data is not available for these geographic areas anywhere else that I know of. It's also possible to disaggregate by race. So here we can look at the white homeownership rate across council districts, the second homeownership map of homeownership rates by council districts, and so on for the other groups. So to my knowledge, I think this is really the first time that we've provided any online tools that do disaggregate by race. So really excited about this too. We also provide data going back to 1990 so that people can look at trends, which then brings out the problem. How do you look at the past data when the boundaries keep changing? And so as an example, here's Council District 1, where that pink border shows the current boundary and the green area shows the past boundary in the previous round of redistricting, and then in 2003, where Champlin gets added, and then 1993, when there's some cities on the western end of Lake Minnetonka added. District 13 is even worse. That has changed a lot over time. And so this makes it really difficult to examine change over time. But what we've done is to standardize all those geographic boundaries to what in this case are the pink outline and the blue outline, or purple, so that when you're looking at homeownership rates in District 13, you'll know that that District 13 refers to the current District 13 and not a changing set of areas. And then finally, people will have the option to download easy-to-print reports, so easy to just print to a PDF or to paper for handing out to whomever you might want. So, and that, again, we're really hoping to get more the data on detailed groups for race and ethnicity, hoping to get that up at some point this year. But for now, yeah, this is the major information from that May release of census data. And that's it. Except for whatever questions you might have, which I am happy to answer.
That's it? That's a lot.
It is. I apologize for the flood. There's a lot of data.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and I'm glad that we have the online tool that we can go in and play with a little bit and kind of dig in. We've been waiting for this information for 5 years, and thanks to the census, now we'll be able to get that. I did have a question about the ACS, I think it is, the community survey that we used to use. That was the closest that we could get to the disaggregated data. Is that still useful? And if so, how would we be using it?
Madam Chair, it is still useful. I think it is not collected in the same way, or had not been collected in the same way as the 2020 census did. Usually you had to cobble things together from the tribal identification of American Indian and Indigenous people, the ancestry of, well, all groups, but especially Black groups for the ancestry question, and then Asian groups did have some more detailed race information, but in this standardized way, that has not been available in the ACS, the American Community Survey. They are, I think, collecting that data now in this newer, more standardized format. So that will be, coming out later, and will allow us to, look in greater detail, I think, in the future. But for now, it's kind of waiting for that to work along the pipeline.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Tony Carter?
Yeah, I am just really amazed at the information that you've been able to share with us today. I'm very, very thankful for it. As we look toward the regional work that we have to do, who we are absolutely makes a difference. So this delving into information about our region, who we are, who we're becoming, what kind of changes make what sorts of difference in our work. It's very telling from what you've just shared with us, but I am looking real forward to a translation or, digesting of some of this to what the implications may be as we look forward to the work to put together our 2050 plan. Thank you. Very impressed with it. Even if some of the data is shocking, it's all very, very helpful. And, even if we don't have the disaggregation that we need, I'm appreciative of what you've been able to present and of our advocacy for greater federal breakdowns, as we look to the future. I want to mention also, just a point of personal privilege, that I looked out and I was so thrilled to see Ryan O'Connor here, becoming more familiar with our work as our regional administrator now. I was going to say our future regional administrator. And I guess that is true because it won't be until March that you officially join us. But thank you so much for being here. I also wanted to mention that Ryan's work in Ramsey County, really began, I got to know Ryan there, with the Who Are We work. It was taking census information. It was presenting that to us, helping us to gain a better understanding of who we are and who we are becoming in Ramsey County, that laid the foundation for all of the work that's been done there, some of which was referenced here today. And so I'm so looking forward to Ryan's participating and partnering with this council as we look toward the new regional development guide and as we do all of our work. But I also wanted to say hello because I missed the announcement of Ryan at the meeting in December. So thank you for allowing me to do so. Thank you for being here with us.
You are so welcome. Any other comments? Councilmember Little?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. And just a quick question, and just to say thanks again for this presentation, for packaging this in such an understandable way, and it's good to know where we are, right, and where we need to go. I have a question about the interactive tool. Is parts of that live now? I was looking around our website, I just can't find it. So can you please?
Click on that and you get to it.
Is that, okay,
It
on
is
this?
available now, yes. You can either click on the link in this presentation, or what might be easier probably for people who do not have access to this presentation right now would be to go to metrocouncil.org/census2020, and you'll find the link there too.
Yeah, I know a lot of people who will be interested in using this tool, so I want to share it.
That'd be great, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Good. Well, thank you so much. As a person with a background in analysis, I will definitely be digging in and probably be having some questions because I'm going to be trying to combine information and see what I can come up with. I will just be having a field day, so thank you so much. At this time, we have council member reports. If anyone has anything they'd like to share. Okay, Peter.
I do. I just wanted to give a shout out. This is a little bit dated information that the council received a prestigious award from the Environmental Protection Agency for our water efficiency grant program that we give out to cities for water efficiency. And so, yeah, very sweet award from the EPA. So, yay, yes.
Wonderful news. Thank you for sharing that. Any other reports or information? We have to my right, Judy Jacoby. Did I say your last name right?
Jacoby.
Jacoby, sitting in for our regional administrator, our interim deputy regional administrator, Phil. Do you have anything to report?
Nothing to report.
Okay, thank you for coming. And then our general counsel representative, Dan.
Nothing to report.
Nothing to report. Okay, with that and having no further business, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you so much.